This is A Word, a podcast from Slate. I'm your host, Jason Johnson. In the closing weeks of the 2024 presidential campaign, the media and many political leaders have latched on to the idea that black male support for Kamala Harris is weak and it could cost her the election. But is this based on facts or stereotypes or vibes about black men? We'll find out.
This idea that we're going to experience some sort of racial realignment like we did over the course of the 20th century. No analyst I've spoken to has said that that's what we're going to see.
Separating myth from reality on black male voters and Kamala Harris. Coming up on A Word with me, Jason Johnson. Stay with us. Welcome to A Word, a podcast about race and politics and everything else. I'm your host, Jason Johnson. The closing days of the 2024 presidential campaign are upon us. Election day happens in little over a week, and the polls show that Vice President Harris is locked in a tight race with former President Donald Trump. One area of concern for Democrats that has emerged really in recent weeks, but going back to even earlier in the summer with Joe Biden, is the status of black male voters. Some public opinion polls show that there is skepticism amongst black men about the Democratic Party in general and Harris specifically, and suggest that Trump could win a significant number of their votes, enough to tip the election in his favor in some swing states. But this idea of a significant defection of black voters from the top of a Democratic ticket has emerged in the past only for election results to show that those voters are still solidly behind the Democratic candidate. So what's happening this time? Are black men really prepared to vote for Donald Trump over Kamala Harris, or are they just going to stay home? And if not, what's fueling the panic of what they're going to do? Join us now to talk about all of this is Brandon Tensley. He's the national politics reporter for Capital B News, a nonprofit news organization focusing on the issues that impact African Americans. His recent report on this issue is titled, "What Headlines Miss About Black Men's Support for Kamala Harris." Brandon Tensley, welcome back to A Word.
Glad to be back.
So I'll start with this. This has been a really interesting issue that I think requires some real context. This narrative about black men not supporting Kamala Harris has been out there for a long time, right? It was first with Joe Biden. Black men weren't going to vote for Joe Biden. Then it was black men don't like the Democrats. Now, of course, that Harris has been the nominee for a couple of months, it's black men aren't going to vote for Harris. What do you think is missing in the political coverage of black men in this particular issue about their relationship with Vice President Harris?
I think a couple things. The first thing that comes to mind is the sort of wider sort of historical context about how black men vote for the Democratic candidate. So there's this sort of mass panic that black men are sort of defecting in huge numbers from the Democratic Party. Is this sort of a racial realignment in our politics? And I think that just has never actually been borne out in any election results. And so, at the end of the day, as several sources have told me, when the dust settles, black men will probably be the second most pro-Harris voting bloc after black women, right? And so this idea that, 30% of black men are going to vote for Donald Trump seems like a misguided sort of fever dream. And so that's one thing that I think is missing. And then a second thing I think gets sort of overlooked is, we are hearing about just sort of broader frustration that black voters have with the Democratic Party. I don't think that's new to this election. I think talk to any black person and they can probably tell you about I wish the Democratic Party would do X, Y, Z, or that they would pay attention to us more outside of presidential election years. But I think, when November hits, we're still going to see the overwhelming majority of black people still voting for the Democratic Party.
So I am fond of saying on TV and other places, these polls ain't loyal. That people, you cannot trust the polls. And it's not because polling is inherently flawed. It's because polling has to be looked at as a trend, not a snapshot, not a predictor of what's going to happen. What do you think you've seen as far as just looking at reporting is bad about the reporting on polling in particular? Because what I have noticed when it comes to polling of black men, first off, the sample sizes are generally very small. There are polls of 1,000 people and there's 80 black people, period. And they're extrapolating from that because the pollsters like Hit Strategies or Cornell Belcher that specifically target black people, they've more or less shown no major changes. So what do you think is wrong in the reporting about polling?
Sometimes I think it's a matter of which Black men are you talking to for this polling or for reporting. Are they the sort of Black men who actually can give sort of broader reflection on actual trends that we're seeing among this group? So I think part of it for me is just sort of that question of like, who are your sources? Who are you going to get this kind of information?
What are some of the facts that you've shared in your reporting, certainly this recent article, that suggests that some of these concerns about Black male voters are overblown?
Yeah, like I think one sort of poll that people have been looking at is the New York Times Siena College polls that are reflecting the sort of frustration that Black voters have with the Democratic Party. And I think, every time one of these polls sort of comes out, I sort of like roll my eyes and I'm just like, my editor and I are going to have to talk about this and how we want to address it, because it's inevitably going to sort of whip up this like national sort of like frenzy about what Black men are doing or what Black voters are doing, despite the fact that, in 2020, Black men overwhelmingly turned out for Joe Biden. In 2016, Black men overwhelmingly turned out for Hillary Clinton. So I think even when we're just looking at these like very recent historical sort of like trends and patterns when it comes to Black political behavior, we're not seeing any, I think, meaningful signs or meaningful sort of reasons to have this sort of panic. It also doesn't allow people to actually address the policy concerns that Black people have, because it becomes this sort of dichotomy of like, are Black people going to essentially be the cause for a second Trump administration because they're not voting for the Democratic Party as much as like we quote unquote want them to? And it doesn't actually give Black people any sort of like political dimension to like voice our policy concerns, things that we want, our next commander in chief to be doing for us. And so I think that sort of texture is what sort of infuriates me the most about these conversations, that lack of texture.
We're going to take a short break. When we come back, more on Kamala Harris and Black male voters. This is A Word with Jason Johnson. Stay tuned.
I said to Roger, the last thing you are fair and balanced. That should have been my slogan.
When the Fox News Channel first went on the air, it promised to change television.
Few broadcasts take any chances these days, and most are very politically correct. Well, we're going to be different.
It's going to be kick-ass, and I want to be part of it.
I'm Josh Levine. In this season of Slow Burn, we'll look at the moment in the early 2000s when Fox News became a political and cultural force.
I'm okay with wearing an American flag. And if you're not, I think you need to examine who you are.
You'll hear from Fox insiders, many who've never spoken out before.
I was not told about that beforehand, for good reason. I wouldn't have gone along with it.
And you'll hear from the activists and comedians who tried to stop it.
He said, "You're being sued by Fox." I went, "Really? That's fabulous."
Slow Burn Season 10, The Rise of Fox News. Hear the entire season now, wherever you listen.
Hey, I'm Hannah.
And I'm Leela. Season 11 of The Stoop is here.
We're telling stories about the Black diaspora.
We ask questions like, why do so many African elders love country music?
Why do you keep calling her Auntie's friend? We all know who she really is.
And what's it like being a Black conservative college student?
And a community conversation right in time for the elections.
Listen to The Stoop on your favorite podcast player.
This is Jason Johnson, host of A Word, Slate's podcast about race and politics and everything else. I want to take a moment to welcome our new listeners. If you've discovered A Word and like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts. And let us know what you think by writing us at aword@slate.com. Thank you. You're listening to A Word with Jason Johnson. Today, we're talking about Black male voters with Brandon Tensley of Capital B News. So here's the thing. I think part of what I've also seen, and I'm curious what your thoughts are about this, is that we have seen this influx of Black men criticizing Kamala Harris. We've had Judge Joe Brown, right, who used to be, an on-TV judge. You have Antonio Brown and Le'Veon Bell, who are two former prominent players of the Pittsburgh Steelers, just come out and endorse Donald Trump and have vulgar T-shirts. You've had previously rappers who were very critical of Donald Trump, like, Snoop Dogg, are now suddenly, I ain't got nothing but love for Donald Trump because he commuted the sentence of one of his friends. So some of it appears to be these prominent black male celebrities that are comfortable with Trump or critical of Harris. From your reporting, do they really make that much of a difference? Do you think these prominent black names are reflective of a trend? Are they just being paid off by Trump? Where do you think that plays in?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head when it comes to like, people have to have some sort of connection between sort of why somebody, a black celebrity, is endorsing someone and why that person is seen as sort of like a role model for how people should vote. And I think, to me, like, that's actually like incredibly lazy and sort of dehumanizing in some ways when reporters sort of suggest that, like, oh, because a famous black person said X, every other black person is going to follow suit, right? And so we saw something similar actually back during sort of like the height of COVID, when I think Nicki Minaj was like tweeting stuff about like her cousin and like allegedly his like body's reaction to like a COVID vaccine or like something like that. And I remember people were just like, oh my God, like, is this going to fuel COVID skepticism among like black people? And I'm just like, why would your everyday black person be looking to Nicki Minaj for like medical advice? And so I think, to bring it back to like this 2024 election, why would, my mother, my dad be looking at, what 50 Cent is saying or someone else is saying in the election to shape their opinion? And so I think that sort of gets sort of like overhyped in a lot of the political reporting about sort of like, oh, because, this famous black person says X, does this indicate some sort of like mass trend among black people? And I don't think it's the sort of like question that people would ask of like a famous white person who says something and like, oh my God, is this indicative of like a mass shift among like the quote unquote white vote or something like that?
So we've also seen throughout this campaign, and I'll just say up front, I think it's a form of sort of disinformation, the supposed man on the street and or focus group conversations where there's always some prominent Republican, black man. There was a CNN town hall where a prominent black person in town hall who was supposedly an undecided voter turned out to be like a local Republican activist. And of course, he didn't like Harris. You had the viral clip of Sky News supposedly going to a random basketball game around Macon, Georgia, and found all of these black male, Trump voters, despite the fact that it was a county that has like a 72% Democratic voter registration. Or Don Lemon did a supposed man on the street segment in Cleveland, where he supposedly finds all these black men who vote or are going to vote for Donald Trump. Where do you think that trend comes from? Because I'll be honest with you, Brandon, most of these, I think, are clickbait. If you go and talk to 100 black people and 3 of them say, I'm voting for Trump, what's the story that's going to get more attention? The 297 who say I'm voting for Harris, or the 3 black men wearing MAGA t-shirts? But is there something real to this, or is it just sort of a clickbait environment that we have in the 2024 election?
Yeah, I mean, the cynical part of me just wants to say that it's a way to sort of like a juicy story. And you're looking for that story at the expense of like giving any sort of like dimension or complexity to the communities you're supposedly reporting on. And, that reminds me of, I think it might have been a CNN special, maybe like a couple months ago, or a CNN segment. And it was just like the framing of it felt a little sort of off to me because it sort of started by, Kamala Harris is actually, getting more support among black voters than Biden was enjoying before he dropped out of the race. But then the segment sort of pivots to talking to this like arch conservative local Republican leader, I think in Virginia, this black woman. I question sort of like, what is the purpose of that kind of story? And I think to your point, I can only imagine that you think that this is the sort of story that will like attract more eyeballs than a story that is like, actually black people are behaving politically in the way that we expect them to behave politically.
So, Brandon, in 2019, when Harris was actually running for the Democratic nomination, there's a lot of criticism out there that it was like, Kamala's a cop. She was viciously and happily throwing black men in jail. And, some black nativists, again, who were being amplified online, so we never know how authentic these feelings are, who are questioning her identity, questioning whether or not that she was actually black. Do you find in sort of your reporting, do those sorts of issues with Harris still linger? And do you think they have some particular disproportionate effect on black men? Or do you think that was sort of a fever dream of when she was attempting to be the top of the ticket 4 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question because I actually haven't heard sort of her stances in 2019 come up, at least in my reporting, as some sort of huge demerit against her, sort of like being in the White House. And, part of that, I think, is how we even sort of like contextualize these larger conversations is like 2019 Kamala Harris, that was just like a very different sort of political game than what she's doing now, right? I think the issues that she ran into then were, how do I sort of fit in on this overcrowded stage where there are people to my left and there are people to my right in terms of your politics. And so I think she sort of floundered with, how do I actually sort of stand out in this very overcrowded Democratic primary? But in terms of like the way that she has grappled with some of those stances in 2024, I haven't actually seen that come up in my reporting as sort of a huge problem. I will say one thing that I've heard people say that they're glad that it seems like she sort of moderated her message on was Kamala versus like the sort of convict narrative, really just like the framing of like, okay, but there are actually a lot of Black people who are sort of like unfairly locked up. And so I think I saw her sort of, at least to me, it looked like she sort of moderated that message, and she changed it more to like, this is like me, like a cop, a former cop, somebody against a predator, somebody who tries to take advantage of a system, as opposed to a sort of broader sort of like me against a convict. And I think that could rub a lot of Black people the wrong way, because it's like, well, we know what criminal justice looks like in this country.
We're going to take a short break. When we come back, more about Black male voters with Brandon Tensley of Capital B News. This is A Word with Jason Johnson. Stay tuned. You're listening to A Word with Jason Johnson. Today, we're talking with Brandon Tensley of Capital B News about Kamala Harris and Black male voters. So, even though we're trying to center a Black woman who will be president of the United States, we got to talk about the former Black president, Barack Obama, and his recent comments about the need for stronger Black male support for Kamala Harris. We have a clip. Here it is.
On the other side, you have someone who has consistently shown disregard, not just for the communities, but for you as a person. And you're thinking about sitting out? I'm not. But, Cousin Pookie might be. And you're coming up with all kinds of reasons and excuses. I've got a problem with that. Because part of it makes me think, and I'm speaking to men directly now, part of it makes me think that, well, you just aren't feeling the idea of having a woman as president. And you're coming up with other alternatives and other reasons for that. And I think anybody you are talking to in a barbershop, anybody you are talking to in your house, in your family, at church, who is coming with that kind of attitude, I think you have to ask them, well, how can that be? Because the women in our lives have been getting our backs this entire time.
Brandon, what did you think when you heard that clip? And what stood out to you about not just what Obama said, but some of the reactions in the press to what President Obama said?
Yeah, I was actually kind of surprised that it really just like took off. Like, I think it was like one evening, like right before bed, and all of a sudden I just saw like a lot of people on Twitter just like really railing against it. Like, I like to think that I know like what he was like getting at and where that was coming from, right? He's somebody who obviously cares very much about his own legacy in the White House. He is somebody who is, standing behind Kamala Harris, wants to support her. And frankly, I imagine he's worried, right? Like, he knows that this is going to be an election that is won by votes in the margins in a handful of battleground states. And he wants Black people to turn out at the highest possible sort of like level. All of that being said, I just think like tactically, that approach, I just can't imagine that approach in any world would be useful, because what you're sort of doing is like you're elevating, honestly, the same kinds of like narratives and tropes about Black men in particular that you see from some people on the right? This idea that like Black men are sort of misogynist or like inherently misogynist, the idea that Black men are sort of like lazy. And so I just think like if you're trying to like energize a base or part of a base, I was just like, why would you say that?
What about the idea that part of what Obama said was a bit of a tempest in a teapot? And by that, I mean, when I talk to my graduate students who are, mid to late 20s at Morgan State University, none of them had even heard about this. And it seemed like the kind of thing that political operatives and political journalists and analysts may have had strong feelings about. But the general public that doesn't watch every single waking moment, does your average Black man in America really feel like Barack Obama's looking down on them? Because it seems to me like it was a big echo chamber moment, but it wasn't one that necessarily affected anybody who doesn't do the kinds of things you and I do.
Right. No, I think that is such a sharp observation because, even the way that I sort of like came into this was Twitter, right? So it's like the people who spend a lot of time on Twitter, more time than can possibly be healthy, were the ones who are really sort of driving a sort of conversation around this. But I'm sure like if I texted like my cousins or my dad, people who are not like political journalists, they might be like, what are you talking about? A, but then also B, they're just like, he kind of has a point. And so like, I remember there was a moment where I was talking with a couple of other editors at Capital B and was like, okay, like how do we sort of like think about this? Because on the one hand, we were just like, it sounds like it was like a tough love conversation, the sort of thing you might expect on like a sitcom in the 90s where it's just like Uncle Phil like comes in and he needs to give Will a talk. Right. And so it's like it does have that sort of like approach. But sometimes I think what happens is like when you have those kinds of more sort of like maybe culturally specific sort of conversations, but then they're aired to like a mixed audience, mixed company, then they're sort of ripe for being sort of blown out of proportion or taken out of context or sort of drained of any complexity. And so I think to your point, even though I think to me, like the tone was off, I don't think that like he was saying this in a way that like he like hates Black men or something like that.
A reporter actually asked Kamala Harris what she thought about Obama's comments. We're going to play what she had to say.
Let me first say that I'm very proud to have the support of former President Barack Obama. And I think that the important point that I will make over and over again is I don't assume to have the votes of any demographic locked down. I have to earn their vote. And I'm going to work as I've been to earn that vote and to win on November 5th.
So, Brandon, soon after this interview, the Harris campaign released a bunch of policy proposals specifically targeted at Black men. There's a lot to unpack with that, but I'll just start at the surface level. Does that make a difference? Like, does it actually, at a practical level from your reporting, make a difference that the Harris campaign released a white paper specifically targeting policies towards Black people? And I'll put this in comparison. The only other time we ever saw this happen was Trump's Platinum Plan that came out in 2020 that turned out to be a farce and had Ice Cube's fingerprints all over it. Do you think it made a difference this time? Do you think it moved the needle? Or again, was it something that just was exciting in the echo chamber?
Again, because it's not like Black men were sort of like running away from the Democratic Party or voting for Kamala Harris. So I don't think it'll make a difference in terms of like actual turnout on election day. Like that's not what I've been hearing from analysts in my reporting. But I think the difference that it could make that still feels meaningful is it helps to sort of like change the narrative, right? She can sort of address this in a way that feels substantive, that feels heartfelt, but then it doesn't become sort of like a sticking point in the, final weeks before the election. And so in some ways, I think it's about sort of like image. It's about projecting sort of like, this is the kind of Democratic Party that I want. I want one that is explicit about how you fit into it. And so I think that's nothing to sneeze at. And so but I think that's sort of mostly what that does. What is the opportunity agenda for Black men? I think that's more what that does, as opposed to like all of a sudden like 100% of Black men are voting for Kamala Harris or something like that.
What is some of the historical context for Black male voting? Because, for example, before Barack Obama, and it's slowly been, moving back to its medium, Republicans usually got anywhere from, 10 to 14% of the African-American vote as a whole. That's always been the case. Obama, the numbers went down to, I think like John McCain got maybe 5% of the Black vote. And I think Romney might have gotten 8% of the Black vote. So overall, are we seeing Donald Trump really make overall inroads with Black voters? Is he going to, from actual reporting and actual sources, is he going to break 15%, or is most of this just sort of hype and conversation?
From what I've been hearing, most of this is just it's hype and conversation. I have not heard anyone say that they think Donald Trump will get more than like 13% sort of at most of Black support. And that's not to say that like, the difference between like 13% and like 9% won't matter as presidential elections, get closer and closer in terms of how they're decided. But this idea that like we're going to experience some sort of like racial realignment like we did sort of like over the course of like the 20th century, no analyst I've spoken to has said that that's what we're going to see. I mean, if that does happen, that would be like a massive story, right? But nothing sort of indicates that that's actually what we're going to see in November.
So, Brandon, I'm going to ask you a question that we can probably only have in the safe confines of a conversation on a word. Here are the facts. The facts are that Vice President Harris is a Black woman. Her father is a very pro-Black Jamaican American. Her mother was Indian American. Her personal life, she seems to have had, at least one or two prominent Black male partners. Former San Francisco Mayor Willie Brown, Montel Williams, the talk show host, and her current husband, who she's just celebrated 10 years of marriage with, who we also had on a word, is Doug Emhoff, who is a white Jewish American lawyer. These are the facts about Kamala Harris. Is there a world in which these very clear realities about who she is, both identity-wise and lifestyle choices, are having a particularly negative effect on her image or on her popularity with Black men? Do you think that that is the case? Have you seen any evidence of that in conversations that you've had with people or your reporting in general?
This is fascinating to me only because I've not heard this come up a single time in when I've been like reporting on sort of Kamala Harris's identity and life in relation to Black voters. I've not heard this come up as an issue. I've actually only really heard it come up as a desired attack point with Republicans, actually, trying to use sort of like the same playbook that many Republicans used against Barack Obama, someone who also has a very sort of like rich multicultural heritage. And so like, I think this is fascinating, but I don't think that this will have sort of like a meaningful effect on the race and how Black men vote for Kamala Harris, partly just because like, I think this gets to what we've been talking about the rest of this episode about, Black people have like a very sort of complex political and personal sort of like realities. And so I think one interesting thing to me about Kamala Harris that I've heard from some analysts is that like the complexity of her own identity and life is interesting because it adds a degree of complexity to how we think about what Black people in America can look like.
I just have to add, because I always thought this is sort of key, the kind of person who wouldn't vote for Kamala Harris because they don't think she's authentically Black, the kind of person, the kind of Black man that wouldn't vote for Kamala Harris because her husband happens to be a white Jewish man, probably ain't voting in general and in particular wouldn't be voting for Democrats. So I've always found those to be sort of bad faith arguments that are brought up as sort of straw men in a conversation. Like if you've got issues with Harris, if those are the kinds of issues that you have, you were going to vote for her anyway. And it's certainly not the kind of thing that she would be able to change or mollify just because she put out a white paper that's going to help black men get loans to start new businesses.
Right. Like, I think that the kind of movement that she's trying to create among voters is the difference between someone who like, oh, I don't know if I'm going to like feel motivated to register to vote, but now let me go register to vote, as opposed to like, I need to get this person to overcome weeks before an election, overcome some deep-seated bigotry. I don't think that's her sort of game plan right now.
We're heading into the closing days of the race. What is the main focus you're hearing from analysts and campaigners and political observers about what the Harris campaign is doing to turn out black men? Because what I have seen and observed, and again, I use my students all the time as a focus group, but every single student, I have like 25 kids in my undergraduate class at Morgan State. Out of 25, 21 are registered to vote. Only 4 aren't registered to vote. And those 4 are all black men. All of these students are inclined, they probably would vote for Harris if I managed to get them registered to vote in time. But the issue is not so much Harris versus Trump, but it seems in many instances with black men, it's Harris versus the couch. What are campaigns doing to get disenchanted and disaffected men, specifically black men, off the couch to realize that their vote will actually make a difference?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I've been hearing is people really trying to impress upon Black voters, Black men in particular, that things can get worse. A sort of how do you incentivize, to put it lightly, people to vote, is to say that, a lot of people maybe sort of forgot, like, oh, like maybe the first Trump administration like wasn't that bad, or like, the country survived, but sort of thinking like, okay, but Trump 2.0, if that happens, somebody who has been centering his campaign on sort of revenge, been on this sort of like revenge tour where he very much is angry and furious in a way that, frankly, in 2016, it seemed like he was more about showboating. Whereas like now it seems like, oh, like there's actually a sort of, he has an axe to grind against people. And so impressing upon people that things absolutely can get worse under a second Trump administration is what I've been hearing from people. And we've already seen this, right? Thinking about the effects of Trump's Supreme Court nominations on reproductive justice, right? I mean, you're hearing more of these stories about the absolutely horrific experiences of women who have to sort of like navigate this like patchwork system of where they can actually have access to reproductive care, and sometimes to like dire consequences. And so like telling people that like this will become more of the norm under a second Trump administration, I think that's what I've mostly been hearing is, just clarifying the stakes of this election.
And the stakes are high. Brandon Tensley is a reporter for Capital B News. Thank you so much for joining us today on A Word.
Thank you for having me.
And that's A Word for this week. The show's email is aword@slate.com. This episode was produced by Kristie Taiwo-Makanjuola. Ben Richmond is Slate's Senior Director of Podcast Operations. Alicia Montgomery is the Vice President of Slate Audio. Our theme music was produced by Don Will. I'm Jason Johnson. Tune in next week for A Word.